Objective 6, identifying sampling bias, the non-response bias, and the response bias of the study. Sampling bias occurs if the technique used to obtain the sample favors one group of individuals over another. The way to avoid this type of bias is to create your sample using a simple random sample. For example, a social studies teacher would like to know whether or not people are in favor of having Hillary Clinton, a Democrat, as the next president of the United States. The teacher then sends out a survey to all people on the mailing list of the magazine The Weekly Standard, which is a well-known conservative magazine, which is the sampling favor. This would be considered a type of sampling bias. A non-response bias exists when individuals selected to be in the sample who do not respond to the survey have different opinions from those who respond. This can happen when individuals simply refuse to be part of the study. For example, a politician wanted to know what % of Americans favored the legalization of marijuana. To do this, he mails out a survey to people across America. However, many of the people who smoke marijuana and received the survey were too high to send the survey back to the politician. This would be an example of non-response bias. Now, a response bias occurs if surveyed people's answers do not match with what they really think or what is really true. And that could be because of an interviewer error or the wording of a question. So, for example, on many dating websites, people are asked to disclose their income. Many people, however, overstate when stating their income. Another example, a professor asks her students to raise their hand whether or not they have used any sort of illegal drugs. Now, a response bias can also result from the wording of questions. So, for example, let's compare these two questions. Number 1, do you brag about your past successes with others? That's a negative. Do you help others by sharing your past successes? That's considered positive. However, both of these are yes-no questions, which can create bias because people tend to answer yes to be more polite. So a better question would be, do you share your past successes with others or keep them to yourself? Also in a survey, it is good to switch around the order of the two choices. So some surveys should also include the question, do you keep your past success to yourself or do you share them with others? Another example, we want to determine the types of sampling bias in the sampling method and then explain. So we have sampling bias, non-response bias, and response bias. A student surveys some students on campus in the evening and finds that 16 of 20 students are part-time students. He uses the data to predict the percentage of all students at his college who are part-time students. This is a sampling bias since the student only surveyed students at the evening. Next question. A simple random sample of American adults are asked, do you post messages on all of your friends' Facebook posts every day because you like Facebook so much? The pollster uses the data to predict the percentage of all Americans who post messages in their friends' Facebook posts every day. This is a response bias since the wording of the question has a negative connotation. Next, a pollster selects adults in a bar in the afternoon, asking them if they neglect their children. Of the 12 customers surveyed, 3 say no and the others do not respond. The pollster uses data to predict the percentage of adults who neglect their children. It's a sampling bias since we are surveying people in a bar in the afternoon. It's a non-response since many people we surveyed did not respond. And it's a response bias since most people wouldn't admit to neglecting their children. Now, guidelines for constructing survey questions. When constructing a survey question, do not include judgmental words. Avoid asking a yes/no question. If the question includes 2 or more choices, switch the order of the choices for different respondents, and then address just one issue. So, for example, identifying bias. For each study, identify possible forms of bias, and then also discuss the sampling error. So throughout a week, a group of students surveys other students studying in the library and finds that 855 of the 950 students study every day. The group concludes that 90% of all students at the college study every day. Now, the sampling method favors students who study in the library over those that don't, which is a sampling bias. Also, students busy studying for a test might refuse to take part in a survey, which is a non-response bias. And finally, students who are surveyed might exaggerate how often they study, which is a response bias. So even if the group of the students had performed sampling without bias, there would still likely be sampling error. So the population percentage would probably not equal the sample percentage, although it would be close. Number 2, SNAP is the U.S. food program for low-income individuals and families. A conservative television news station conducts a call-in survey asking callers, should federal funding for SNAP be decreased so the national budget can be balanced? Of the 1,420 callers, 994 answered yes. The station concludes that 70% of all Americans think that the budget for SNAP should be decreased. Now, because the station is conservative, its viewers will tend to be conservative too. So the survey favors Americans who are conservative, which is a sampling bias. Also, the question is a yes-no question, which is a response bias. And finally, the question includes 2 issues: reducing the SNAP budget and balancing the national budget, which is a response bias. So even if the station performs sampling without bias, there would still likely be sampling error, so the population percentage would probably not equal the sample percentage, although it would be close.